Welcome back. In our previous lectures, we covered what ethics is and examined two ethical theories, relativism and ethical egoism. We said that ethics is defined as rational reflection on human conduct with the aim of directing that conduct in appropriate ways. We saw how it is through the study of ethics where we take a step back from our active lives to examine it and to see whether we are living the life that we should. When it came to relativism and ethical egoism, we saw that both had some insights and also potential difficulties that needed resolving. The insight in relativism is that ethics has to be personal because it is lived out by us, individual human beings. We are concrete individual beings practicing ethics. And so an ethics that is merely abstract is not an ethics that can be lived out. And if such an ethics cannot be lived out, then it does not pertain to philosophy, because philosophy is a way of life, not just studying abstract ideas. We also ran into a difficulty with relativism. We saw that if morality is purely and only relative to different people, then we can't say that certain moral evils, like the Holocaust or the murdering of innocent human beings, is wrong. We could say it's wrong for us, but not wrong for another. And if it's not wrong for another, then we wouldn't be able to say that what someone like, say, Hitler did was actually wrong, regardless of what he thought. We then covered ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is actually an attempt to correct and fix up moral relativism. The ethical egoist takes the good in moral relativism, that ethics should be personal, and tries to fix up the alleged problems. Ethical egoism builds on moral relativism by showing us that not only is morality personal, but it has to do with human flourishing, with us getting better, not worse. It is a moral theory that cares about individual progress, not just mere change. Progress is always directed to what's better, but that is not necessarily the case with change. However, we also ran into a problem with ethical egoism. First, we saw that ethical egoists can't actually say that self-interest is the foundation for morality. Because once we ask the question, why is self-interest good? The ethical egoist has to give us some answer. Whatever answer they give has to point beyond self-interest. Secondly, we saw that ethical egoism actually reduces to moral relativism, because it takes human flourishing to be tied to rational self-interest. We saw the example with politics, how it may be in my own rational self-interest to elect a candidate into office, but it is not in your self-interest not to elect them. It is in your self-interest not to have them elected. And so it would be good for me to elect them and bad for you, since we have competing self-interests. Now, of course, there may be answers to these objections, but that will be up to you to figure out. Again, ethics isn't just about learning different pros and cons regarding different moral theories. It asks us to reflect upon a way of life. Now, with that introduction, we will turn our attention to a different moral theory that also attempts to keep the good in relativism and ethical egoism while fixing up some of the potential problems. The moral view that we will look at today is called utilitarianism. So what is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is the view that the right action is one that produces the greatest balance of benefit over harm for everyone affected. It seeks the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, there are two things to clarify. First, utilitarianism isn't saying that morality is the greatest good based off of what the majority of people think. We don't just vote on what the greatest good is, because a society can be mistaken about what they think is good. Rather, the greatest good means the greatest well-being. Well-being here is an objective standard, something that is true outside of whatever we think about it. That's the first piece of clarification. Now, the second piece of clarification is that utilitarianism is a consequentialist view. A consequentialist view cares about the consequences or the outcomes, not the way to get to the outcome. For example, suppose again you were living in Nazi Germany and a Jew came to your home to hide. A Nazi then comes to your home asking if you are hiding any Jews. The utilitarian would say, "No, I am not hiding any Jews." The utilitarian would lie. Why? Because lying would save the life of the innocent human being. And since it's good to save innocent human beings, lying seems to be the most appropriate thing to do. Now, already, there are many appealing things about utilitarianism. Most clearly, it seems to answer the Holocaust problem. When we pressed the relativist and the ethical egoist, they had a hard time justifying what to do in that case. But the utilitarian's answer seems pretty clear. If you need to lie in order to protect the life of an innocent person, then lie. That at least seems reasonable. Because what's the alternative? Tell the truth? Then the innocent person dies. Should we stay silent? That's very suspicious and will most likely get the Jew killed. So lying at least seems reasonable here. And so in short, utilitarianism is appealing because we want good outcomes. The second appeal of utilitarianism is that it brings our attention to the fact that we are not persons living in isolation. We live in a community, and we seem to be ordered to being in a community. There is the individual, then there is the family, and from many families we get small communities or neighborhoods or villages. And from there we get cities, and from cities we get states, and from many states we get a country, and from many countries we get a holistic human collective. Utilitarianism therefore honors the fact that we are not just isolated beings. If we were really just isolated beings, then nobody would even be listening to this lecture in the first place, for example. You would just focus on learning the material yourself, from your own self, rather than from some other resource. If we were really isolated beings, then we wouldn't need our families, our friends, and the like. But since we do need our families, friends, and other people, it follows that we are made for community, which is exactly what utilitarianism honors. The third appeal of utilitarianism is that it takes human good seriously. Human good isn't based on preference, like it is in relativism. It isn't based on the ethical egoist's pure self-interest, which actually reduces to relativism. Rather, it bases it off of something more. It sees suffering as actually bad, and well-being as actually good, regardless of what one person or culture says, and regardless of one's own self-interest. Now, the final appeal of utilitarianism is that it claims to fix the alleged problems of relativism and ethical egoism. It tries to fix the problems in relativism because relativism has no standard above the individual or the culture, so it could not condemn the Nazis, for example. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, promises an objective standard so that we can actually condemn the Nazis. It also tries to fix the problems of ethical egoism. Under ethical egoism, what's good is my own flourishing. My own self-interest is the standard of what flourishing is. But this view of ethics is too individualistic. It cannot account for why we live in families and communities. At best, it can only tell us that the family and community should be used for our own self-interest. So really, we should just be using each other for our own benefits. But under this view, how do we make sense of loving one another for their own good? Under ethical egoism, you shouldn't love someone for their own benefit, unless it benefits you to do so. We saw what happened with that, how under this view, I might be justified to let my children cry all night long so that I can get my beauty sleep. But under utilitarianism, that's not the case. I shouldn't let my children cry the whole night unless there is a dire circumstance that would actually be harmful if I did go to them. But since in the vast majority of cases it is not harmful for me to attend to my crying children, I should attend to them for the greater good of my family. And so, in short, utilitarianism seems very promising. It holds to what's true in relativism and ethical egoism while attempting to correct what's problematic. However, like relativism and ethical egoism, utilitarianism isn't without its fair share of difficulties. There are three major objections that we will turn our attention to. The first objection is that utilitarianism changes what we mean by justice in an unrealistic way. Typically, we think that justice requires a kind of proportionality, giving somebody what they deserve or what they are owed. For example, if someone steals a candy bar from the grocery store and gets caught, it wouldn't make sense to give that person the death penalty, regardless of whether we think the death penalty itself is a good or bad thing. A few months of punishment, say like in prison, seems reasonable. Maybe a year or so if, say, this crime was committed continuously based off of past circumstances. But under utilitarianism, we have to ask, why not give that person the death penalty? In fact, if all crimes were punishable by the death penalty, then we would be seeing a significantly lower crime rate, which is an overall good thing, a good for the greatest number of people. Now, of course, we'd have to take some precautions. For example, we shouldn't give the death penalty to the person who stole a candy bar unless we are sure, without any reasonable doubt, that they stole. But if we find that they did steal, why shouldn't they get the death penalty? To us, that sounds pretty extreme. But notice why this follows under utilitarianism. We just said that justice is a kind of proportionality, even giving each person what they are owed. But the utilitarian only cares about the end result, the good outcome. They don't care about how we get there. So under utilitarianism, punishment proportionate to a crime doesn't fully matter. As long as we promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people, like giving the death penalty to all crimes in order to make the world a safer place for innocent civilians, then why not do so? But of course, we would say this sounds like a dystopia. And here's the deeper problem. You might think that the utilitarian at least values justice as a means to a good outcome. But it doesn't seem like they can, because the outcome they want does not even require justice. For example, a city can be perfectly peaceful and safe while executing every petty thief, and that outcome has no proportionality in anywhere. So justice does not fall out of the utilitarian's calculation because it gets outweighed. It falls out because it was never needed in the first place. But if justice just is proportionality, giving each person what they are owed, then a theory that can reach its goal without proportionality at all is a theory that cannot actually value justice. It can only value outcomes that, every now and then, happen to line up with what justice would require. In short, then, the first objection is this. Utilitarianism cares only about good outcomes, and those outcomes can be reached through dystopian measures that bypass justice entirely. That's the first objection. The second objection is this. The second objection has to do with what we mean by the greatest good. Utilitarianism offers us a normative ethical theory. It tells us what we should do in practical situations. We should maximize the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But what is the greatest good? That's a meta-ethical question. It's a question that asks for the foundation of utilitarianism. But utilitarianism doesn't offer us a meta-ethics. It only offers a normative ethical view. But that would be like building a house without a foundation. If you build a house without a foundation, the whole house collapses. Similarly, if we don't know what we mean by greatest good or what counts as the greatest good, then we have an ethical theory without a foundation. So utilitarianism, at best, seems incomplete. It tells us what we should do without explaining why we should do it. Now, to the utilitarianists' credit, there are some who actually do try to offer a foundation. Utilitarians will say that the greatest good is actually pleasure, and that we should maximize pleasure while minimizing pain. They will also note that there are different kinds of pleasures, some higher and more noble than others. For example, there's a pleasure in eating good food, but there's also a pleasure in understanding something for the first time, when that light bulb moment clicks. We wouldn't say that they are the same pleasure, though. One pertains to food, the other pertains to the mind. So some will argue that there are higher and lower pleasures, and that we should try to attain the more noble or higher pleasures than the lower ones. But notice what's going on here in this explanation. We are talking about the quality of pleasure, not the quantity of it. This just raises another question. What makes a pleasure higher or lower? For example, why is the pleasure of eating food when we're hungry lower or less noble than the pleasure we get from understanding something for the first time? In order to rank pleasures from less noble to more noble, we would need some metric or standard to judge which pleasures are higher or lower. But that metric or standard can't be pleasure itself, because we are ranking pleasures. So the very fact that the utilitarian tells us that there are higher and lower pleasures means that the foundation for what's good isn't actually pleasure at all. Instead, it has to be something else. It has to be the standard for what is more noble or lesser pleasures. And so, in short, the second objection is this. The utilitarian does not give us a foundation for their ethical view. And the foundations that they have given actually point beyond themselves. They point beyond pleasure and mere outcomes. The fact that the utilitarian doesn't give us a foundation for ethics leads us to our last objection. Let's go back to our stock Hitler example. Let's pretend that Hitler himself, in this case, is a utilitarian. In this case, he believes that the moral thing to do is to maximize the greatest good for the greatest possible number. In this case, it is for all of Germany and its citizens. Under this view, he thinks we should eliminate the Jews from Germany because it promotes his conception of good. Now let's pretend we are also utilitarians. We are utilitarians who oppose Hitler. We would say to Hitler and the Nazis, no, what you are doing isn't good. It isn't promoting the greatest good for the greatest possible number, and therefore, what you are doing is wrong. But again, what do we mean by good here? In fact, Hitler and us may be operating under two different definitions of good. Because we don't have a shared standard of what we mean by good, we have no way to tell Hitler why what he's doing is wrong. We could, of course, say that what you are doing is killing innocent human beings, and you can't do that. But Hitler and the Nazis can just respond by saying that we have to kill the Jews to promote the greatest good for Germany. And this brings us back to relativism all over again. And so, in short, the third objection is this. Because utilitarianism doesn't provide a standard for what is good, it risks falling into relativism, the very thing utilitarianism tried to refute. Having looked at the pros and cons of utilitarianism, we have to now see where it leads us and what it means for us. Utilitarianism builds on the insights of relativism and ethical egoism. Not only is morality personal and having to do with human flourishing, but it has to do with flourishing of both us and the community. Again, despite the difficulties we run into with utilitarianism, we also see a way forward. Not only does morality have to be personal, about human flourishing, the flourishing of both us and the community, morality also requires an objective element, a shared standard or foundation for what counts as the greatest good. It needs to be a morality that cares not just about the ends, but also the means. Not just the end result, but the way getting there. And so even though we haven't yet found an ethical theory that meets this criteria, we at least now have a criteria for what we need to be looking for. And that itself is progress. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.